On October 24, 1929, the American stock market began a collapse that would erase fortunes built over decades in just a matter of days. Men who had been millionaires on Tuesday morning found themselves bankrupt by Thursday afternoon. Some had been wealthy for generations. Others had made their fortunes during the roaring prosperity of the 1920s. But whether their wealth was old or new, it disappeared with astonishing speed. This wasn't the first time such a thing had happened in history, and it wouldn't be the last. The destruction of wealth follows patterns that repeat across centuries, cultures, and economic systems. Understanding these patterns requires looking beyond individual stories of loss and examining the structural reasons why wealth, once accumulated, so often slips away. Throughout human history, the creation of wealth has always been easier to celebrate than its preservation. Ancient Rome produced countless wealthy families during its centuries of expansion, yet very few of those fortunes survived the empire's eventual decline. The merchant princes of Renaissance Italy accumulated vast holdings through trade and banking, but political upheavals and changing trade routes left many of their descendants in reduced circumstances. The industrial magnates of the 19th century built empires on coal, steel, and railroads, only to see those empires crumble as technology and markets evolved. In each era, the mechanisms of wealth creation changed, but the mechanisms of wealth destruction remained remarkably consistent. What follows is an examination of 10 lessons drawn from historical episodes of massive wealth loss, lessons that reveal how prosperity turns to poverty and why those who possess great wealth are often unable to keep it.
The first lesson concerns the fundamental confusion between income and wealth, a distinction that has trapped countless individuals throughout history. In the years leading up to the French Revolution, many aristocratic families maintained lavish lifestyles that projected an image of enormous wealth. They owned grand estates, employed large staffs, and participated in the expensive social rituals of court life. But beneath this facade, many were drowning in debt. Their estates generated income, certainly, but that income was immediately consumed by expenses that could not be reduced without social humiliation. When the revolution came and the old order collapsed, these families discovered that their apparent wealth had been largely illusory. They had confused the ability to spend with the possession of assets that could be preserved or converted to safety. This pattern appeared again in America during the Gilded Age, when newly wealthy industrialists built massive mansions in Newport and Fifth Avenue. The construction and maintenance of these properties consumed enormous sums. When economic downturns came or when the businesses that generated the income faltered, the mansions became liabilities rather than assets. The wealthy families of Detroit in the mid-20th century learned this lesson as the automobile industry declined. High salaries and generous benefits had supported a comfortable upper-middle-class lifestyle, but when the industry contracted, that lifestyle could not be sustained. Income had created the appearance of wealth without building the foundation necessary for its preservation.
The second lesson involves the dangerous power of leverage and borrowed money. The ability to borrow against assets or future income has existed in various forms for thousands of years, and for just as long it has been destroying fortunes. In the Dutch Republic during the 1630s, tulip bulbs became objects of frenzied speculation. Traders purchased bulbs not with cash, but with promissory notes, essentially buying on margin. As prices rose, the leverage multiplied both gains and exposure. When the market collapsed in February 1637, those who had borrowed heavily were ruined. The bulbs they owned were suddenly worthless, but the debts remained. A similar dynamic played out in the Mississippi Scheme in France during the early 18th century. John Law's elaborate financial system encouraged borrowing to purchase shares in colonial ventures. When confidence evaporated, the leveraged investors lost everything. The pattern repeated in 1929 when margin buying had become standard practice in American stock markets. Investors could purchase stocks with only a small percentage down, borrowing the rest from brokers. This leverage amplified returns during the bull market of the 1920s, but it also amplified losses when the crash came. Margin calls forced the sale of stocks at depressed prices, which drove prices lower still, triggering more margin calls in a devastating spiral. Those who had built paper fortunes through leverage discovered that borrowed money could destroy wealth as quickly as it had created the illusion of its growth.
The third lesson is that economic booms, no matter how robust they appear, eventually end, yet people consistently behave as if prosperity will continue indefinitely. The South Sea Bubble of 1720 provides a clear illustration. The South Sea Company had been granted a monopoly on British trade with South America, and enthusiasm for the potential profits drove share prices to extraordinary heights. Investors from all social classes, including many members of the aristocracy and even Isaac Newton himself, poured money into the shares.
The assumption underlying these purchases was that the company's profits would justify any price. When reality set in and the company's actual business prospects proved far less lucrative than imagined, the bubble burst. Fortunes vanished. Newton reportedly lost £20,000, a massive sum for the era, and later remarked that he could calculate the motions of heavenly bodies, but not the madness of people. The same assumption of perpetual boom appeared in the American real estate market of the mid-2000s. Housing prices had risen consistently for years, and many assumed this rise would continue. People purchased properties they could not afford, banks lent money based on inflated appraisals, and investment vehicles were constructed on the assumption that real estate could only appreciate. When the market turned in 2007 and 2008, the consequences were catastrophic. Individuals lost homes, investors lost savings, and institutions collapsed. The boom had created a widespread conviction that the rules of economics had somehow changed, that risk had been eliminated through financial innovation. History suggests this conviction appears in every major bubble, and it is always proven wrong.
The fourth lesson concerns the concentration of wealth in a single asset or a narrow range of holdings. Diversification, the spreading of wealth across different types of investments and assets, provides protection against specific disasters. Yet people have consistently failed to diversify, even when they possess the means to do so. The great landowning families of Ireland in the 19th century provide a sobering example. Their wealth was entirely bound up in agricultural estates. When the potato famine struck in the 1840s, their tenants could not pay rent. The land lost its value as a source of income, and many of these families, wealthy on paper, found themselves unable to generate cash. Some were forced to sell estates at distressed prices. Others simply declined into genteel poverty, holding on to empty titles and crumbling houses. A different form of concentration risk destroyed wealth in the American South after the Civil War. The Southern planter class had built its wealth on cotton production using enslaved labor. This wealth was concentrated in land and human property. When slavery was abolished, the entire economic foundation of Southern wealth collapsed. The land remained, but without the forced labor system, it could not generate comparable returns. Those who had been among the richest people in America found themselves struggling to maintain even basic economic security. The lesson appeared again in more recent history when employees of Enron held their retirement savings primarily in company stock. When the company collapsed in 2001, they lost not only their jobs, but also their savings. The concentration of wealth in a single company, no matter how successful it appeared, created a vulnerability that proved devastating. The fifth lesson is that past success often breeds a dangerous disregard for risk. The very experience of having been right, of having made good decisions that generated wealth, can create a confidence that becomes indistinguishable from complacency. The Medici Bank provides an instructive example from the 15th century. For generations, the Medici family had successfully navigated the complex world of European finance, lending to monarchs and popes, managing deposits, and facilitating trade. Their success had made them one of the wealthiest and most powerful families in Europe. But by the late 1400s, the bank had extended large loans to Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy. These loans were risky, but the Medici's past success had made them confident. When Charles died in battle in 1477 without repaying her loans, the bank suffered severe losses. Poor management and continued risky lending followed, and by 1494, the bank had collapsed. Centuries of successful operation had not prevented its destruction. A similar dynamic played out in the career of Jesse Livermore, one of the most famous American stock traders of the early 20th century. Livermore made and lost several fortunes during his lifetime. His early successes in predicting market movements were legendary, but his very success encouraged larger and larger bets. After the crash of 1929, he correctly predicted the market would fall and profited enormously from short selling. But in subsequent years, his confidence led him to take positions that failed. He lost his fortune multiple times and eventually died by suicide in 1940, financially ruined. The pattern suggests that success itself can be a kind of risk, one that blinds people to changing conditions and encourages the very behaviors that lead to loss.
The sixth lesson involves the destructive power of emotional decision-making during periods of crisis. When markets crash or economies collapse, fear and panic drive behavior in ways that often lock in losses that might otherwise have been temporary. The Panic of 1907 demonstrated this principle with brutal clarity. A failed attempt to corner the market in copper triggered a loss of confidence in several banks and trust companies. Depositors, fearing that these institutions would fail, rushed to withdraw their money. This run on the banks forced institutions to sell assets at fire sale prices to raise cash, which further undermined confidence and triggered more withdrawals. Many depositors who joined the panic lost money unnecessarily. Had they waited, their deposits would have been secure, as JP Morgan and other financiers eventually organized a rescue. But fear had driven decisions, and fear is rarely a good advisor. The same emotional dynamic appeared during the financial crisis of 2008. As markets plunged, many investors sold their holdings at the bottom, converting paper losses into permanent ones. Studies conducted in the years following the crisis show that those who maintained their investments recovered their wealth as markets eventually rebounded, while those who sold in panic did not. The historical record suggests that emotional decisions made under stress consistently produce worse outcomes than decisions made with patience and a longer time horizon, yet the emotional pull of panic remains powerful enough to override rational calculation in nearly every crisis.
The seventh lesson is that wealth built on political power or monopoly control is inherently fragile because it depends on the continuation of a specific structure of authority. When that structure changes, the wealth evaporates. The Spanish Empire provides a clear example. After the conquest of the Americas in the 16th century, Spain controlled vast reserves of silver and gold. This wealth flowed into the Spanish treasury and enriched the Spanish nobility. But the wealth was not generated by productive enterprise, it was extracted through political and military control. When Spain's military power declined and its control over the colonies weakened, the flow of wealth stopped. By the 18th century, Spain was no longer a major economic power, despite having once possessed more precious metals than any other European nation. The wealth had been temporary because it was based on control rather than creation. A similar pattern appeared in the Soviet Union during the 20th century. Communist Party officials enjoyed access to resources, goods, and privileges far beyond what ordinary citizens could obtain. This created a kind of wealth based on political position. When the Soviet system collapsed in 1991, that wealth vanished. Political connections that had been valuable became worthless. Those who had lived well under the old system often found themselves with few skills or assets that had value in the new economy. The lesson is that wealth derived from position rather than from ownership of productive assets or portable skills is vulnerable to political change, and political change has been a constant feature of human history.
The eighth lesson concerns the failure to adapt to structural economic changes. Industries rise and fall, technologies become obsolete, trade routes shift. Those whose wealth is tied to declining systems often fail to recognize the change until it is too late. The Hanseatic League illustrates this pattern from medieval and early modern European history. This confederation of merchant guilds and market towns dominated trade in the Baltic and North Sea regions for centuries. The merchants of cities like Lübeck and Hamburg grew wealthy through this trade. But as the age of exploration began and trade routes shifted toward the Atlantic and around Africa to Asia, the importance of Baltic trade declined. The Hanseatic merchants did not adopt quickly enough. They continued to operate within their traditional framework while wealth flowed to Amsterdam, London, and other Atlantic ports. By the 17th century, the League had lost its economic dominance, and the great merchant families saw their wealth decline. A more recent example comes from the American railroad industry. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, railroads were the dominant form of transportation and the source of enormous fortunes. Families like the Vanderbilts built vast wealth from railroad holdings. But the rise of automobiles, trucks, and eventually air travel diminished the centrality of railroads. Those who failed to diversify their holdings away from railroads saw their wealth erode. The failure to adapt to structural change is perhaps more forgivable than some other forms of wealth loss, as recognizing such change requires foresight that is often only clear in hindsight. But the consequences are no less severe.
The ninth lesson is that wealth held in illiquid form can become a trap during economic downturns. Throughout history, individuals have found themselves asset-rich but cash-poor, unable to convert their holdings into money when they needed it most. The British aristocracy in the early 20th century provides a textbook example. Many noble families owned large estates that had been in their families for centuries. On paper, they were wealthy. The land had considerable value and the houses were magnificent. But the estates generated relatively little cash income, especially after agricultural depressions reduced farm revenues. When death duties and taxes increased after World War I, these families faced a crisis. They owed substantial tax bills but had little cash to pay them. Selling parts of the estate was difficult and often achieved only distressed prices. Many families were forced to sell at unfavorable terms or to break up estates that had been intact for generations. The experience was repeated in different form during the Great Depression, when businesses and individuals held assets that could not be sold at reasonable prices. Real estate, stocks, and equipment all had theoretical value, but in a collapsed market, there were no buyers. Those who needed cash to meet obligations or survive found themselves unable to access the value of their holdings. The lesson is that the form in which wealth is held matters as much as the total amount, and liquidity is itself a form of protection that is often undervalued during good times.
The 10th lesson involves the failure to create structures for the preservation and succession of wealth across generations. History is filled with examples of fortunes that were accumulated by one generation and lost by the next. The Rothschild family provides a counterexample that proves the rule. Beginning in the late 18th century, Mayer Amschel Rothschild built a banking business in Frankfurt and strategically placed his 5 sons in major European financial centers. The family created explicit structures for cooperation, for the pooling of information, and for the preservation of capital across generations. These structures helped the family maintain wealth through wars, revolutions, and economic upheavals for more than 2 centuries. Most families did not create such structures. The Vanderbilt family, despite having been one of the wealthiest in America, saw its fortune dissipate over several generations. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the family founder, left an enormous fortune when he died in 1877, but the family did not establish trusts or structures to preserve capital. Each generation spent lavishly, built massive houses, and divided the inheritance among multiple heirs. By the time of a widely reported family reunion in 1973, there was not a single millionaire among the descendants. The wealth had simply been consumed and divided until it was gone. The lesson suggests that wealth preservation requires intentional planning, legal structures, and often a willingness to limit the consumption of any single generation in order to provide for future ones. Without such planning, regression to the mean appears to be the historical norm.
These 10 lessons, drawn from different eras and different contexts, share common threads. Wealth is lost when people mistake temporary conditions for permanent ones, when they fail to prepare for change, when they allow emotion to override judgment, and when they concentrate rather than diversify their holdings. The mechanisms differ across time, but the underlying human behaviors remain consistent. Every major period of wealth creation in history has been followed by a period of wealth destruction. The canal builders of the early 19th century were made obsolete by railroads. The railroad magnates were diminished by automobiles and planes. The manufacturing wealth of the mid-20th century declined as production shifted globally and industries changed. In each case, those who lost wealth often believed their prosperity was secure. They saw their holdings, their income, their position, and they assumed these would continue. History suggests this assumption is almost always wrong.
The patterns visible in historical wealth destruction remain relevant because the fundamental dynamics have not changed. Markets still experience bubbles and crashes. Technologies still disrupt established industries. Political systems still undergo transformations that redistribute wealth and power. Leverage still amplifies both gains and losses. Human psychology still drives emotional decision-making during crises. The specific details change, but the underlying patterns repeat. Recognizing these patterns does not require predicting the future. It simply requires acknowledging that the forces which destroyed wealth in the past continue to operate in the present. The tulip traders of 1637, the South Sea investors of 1720, the margin buyers of 1929, and the mortgage holders of 2008 all experienced different crises, but they all suffered from similar misjudgments about risk, sustainability, and the nature of the booms in which they participated.
Throughout centuries of economic history, one truth emerges with remarkable consistency. Wealth is not usually lost through a single catastrophic decision or an unforeseeable disaster. It is lost through a series of smaller choices that, in aggregate, place capital in increasingly vulnerable positions. It is lost through the failure to recognize when conditions have changed, through overconfidence born of past success, and through the human tendency to believe that the present moment is somehow different from all the moments that came before it. The study of history cannot prevent future losses, but it can provide perspective. It can show that wealth has always been more fragile than it appears, that preservation requires different skills than accumulation, and that the patterns of loss repeat with enough regularity to be recognized if one knows where to look.
If this examination of historical wealth destruction has provided useful perspective, consider subscribing to the channel for more long-form explorations of economic history and the patterns that shape financial outcomes across time. There is much more to explore in the historical record, and future videos will continue to examine how wealth is built, preserved, and lost across different eras and circumstances.